very thankful to be here today for the book launch for Katovich's book, Beautiful Children, the story of Elm Hill School and home for feeble-minded children and youth. My name is Doug Farley, and I'm the director at the Museum of Disability History in Buffalo, and we're very pleased to be here at Syracuse University today. One of the reasons we're pleased to be in a university setting is the museum got its start as a result of another university setting in Buffalo, New York. The president of People, Inc., our sponsoring agency at the museum, Jim Bowles, was teaching a college course at the University of Buffalo. It was a disability awareness, original, one of the very first courses that were being taught at UB. I'll slow down a little. One of the first courses at the University of Buffalo on the topic of disability and disability history. So Jim soon realized that there weren't any resources, or very few resources, to send his students to get more information on the topic. So he took it on as a mission of People, Inc., which is a human service agency in Buffalo, to create a brick and mortar museum dedicated to the task of explaining disability history. And that largely became the center for training people who were going into the human service field. So over the years, we've almost been open 20 years now, 6 years at our present site on Main Street. One of the things that we found we could do to increase understanding and acceptance of people with disability is to create a publishing division, which helped to extend our outreach to a larger audience. We're very pleased when people come to our museum on Main Street in Buffalo, but we realize that we have a much broader audience to address. So we did that through creating a publishing division, People, Inc. Press, in this case I&K for Inc. And we have produced at this point 25 books. Katovitch's book, Beautiful Children, is our 25th book, and we're pleased to present those. We do those largely through what we call the Abandoned History series, which talks about how people would have received, where they would have received, or how they would have received different treatments over the years. The facilities that, for the most part, are now closed and gone. We're not going to talk too much about these particular institutions. We'll let her do that herself today. But I did want to take a moment. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that we're brought a large sampling of our books here to show you today. Well, in addition to showing you, we're also selling them. So you may purchase a book from Michelle at any time this afternoon. We're pleased to do that. Also, it's my pleasure at this point and this time to introduce the founding director of the Museum of Disability History, the former president of People, Inc. Still, even though he's retired, is still doing research for books at the museum and is a all-around welcome resource for the museum. And I'd like to introduce Dr. James Bowles.
Thank you, Doug. As Doug mentioned, we have a small publishing arm called People Inc. Press. We've only really published about a couple dozen books in all the time, and we're pretty selective and we screen carefully. These books came in just before we were publishing our guidelines for publication. We really hadn't had them out yet. And however, I would say, she hit it right on the mark with her draft manuscript. It just happened, it was fine. Our 4 pages of guidelines came out about a week later, but hers was good right from the start. There's a reason we publish books under Abandoned History. And one of the reasons is the school that he wrote about. The history of this school was ignored for over 90 years, first school in America, and it was also abandoned. Nobody was talking about it. Nobody put it together until Dee put in the extensive time, the energy, the effort to record this important part of history. As the editor, I read the manuscript many, many times. And after the second minor edit, I emailed Dee and said, Dee, this is a very good book. And it was. It is a very good book. Well documented, it's an easy read, and it shows the history of the school, which had been ignored for 90 years. I also want to thank your husband Dale. Where's Dale? Dale, we should thank Dale. He did a couple of the pictures, and his work is also in the book. Dee, thank you for putting this together. Elm Hill School is no longer abandoned history.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. People have been asking me all day, you know, are you excited? I said, yeah. Are you nervous? Oh, yeah. Yeah, but, you know, it's nice here to be among friends and to talk about something that's become a really very favorite subject for me, which is the history of people with intellectual and developmental disability in the United States. I first want to tell you where the title for the book came from, but I need to preface it with an editor's note. Historical research about disability involves the use of antiquated terms and discussion of outdated attitudes. These are retained throughout the book for the sake of historical accuracy, but no offense is intended toward any individual or group. When you do historical research on disability, you really have to push past your 21st century sensibilities to really get to what the story is underneath. And the title for the book came from a quote in an article that was published in 1850. The children came to the institution, as almost all idiots are, as helpless in their personal decencies as the veriest infant, and far more disgusting to the eye and every sense of the beholder. But they have been taught to dress decently, to maintain personal cleanliness, and to observe the proprieties of life to such a degree that the teacher and proprietor of the establishment, who had witnessed all the transformation, could not now look upon them and speak of them now as beautiful children. And that's from an article written in 1850 called The Institution for Imbeciles and Idiots, Barre, Massachusetts, 1850. And German, right? And shoot. Okay. We'll do it like this. The Museum of Disability History actually has been involved with this project from an earlier time than maybe even they know. As I was finishing the work for my first book, I was on sabbatical and I decided to visit the Museum of Disability History in Buffalo. Discovered they had a wonderful, wonderful library and decided to do some research there and began to be interested in the history of people with intellectual disability in the United States. And I ran across this picture. And the caption under the photograph read, also in 1848, Dr. Hervey B. Wilbur founded the Institution for Idiots in Barre, Massachusetts. The institution is in a modest house where Dr. Wilbur instructed up to 12 pupils. I looked at it and said, wow, that's going to be a really tight fit, you know, with 12 students and a school for students with intellectual disability. Also, 1848 really surprised me. That seemed quite a bit earlier than anything I had been aware of. I grew up in Massachusetts. My mother was a special education administrator. And I thought I really knew quite a bit of the backstory of special education in Massachusetts, particularly. And I had never heard of Elm Hill. I had never heard of Hervey Wilbur. And so it just sort of stayed with me of, I wonder if anybody even knows about this school. You know, what is this all about? So I started to go through some information. And kind of a research process that was going on while I was teaching, I was working. I found the name of Elm Hill and Hervey Wilbur, who was the founding director of the school, on a website which is a virtual museum, not a brick and mortar museum, but a virtual museum on disability history. It is a wonderful, wonderful resource. If you are ever going to be doing any research into the history of people with disabilities in the United States, this is your number one research place to start, disabilitymuseum.org. And I discovered that there were connections as well to some of the earliest work in intellectual and developmental disability. Dr. Jean-Marc Estard-Itard was the man who worked with the original wild boy of Aveyron, Victor, who was really the first person who at least presented as having a developmental disability. And people tried to educate him. It was Dr. Itard who tried to at first work with Victor and see what he could learn. He had a protege named Edward Seguin, and it was later Americanized to Edward Seguin. Edward Seguin worked in some of the large psychiatric hospitals in France, including Bicêtre, which had a wing specifically for children who had been identified as having intellectual disability. No one had ever tried to teach them until Edward Seguin came along and began to use his methods that he called the physiological method, the way of educating the body in a very holistic way to specifically teach children to go through activities of daily living, to develop their senses, to develop their coordination, and to then gradually bring them to the point where they would be able to read, able to write, and hopefully be able to learn skills that would make them self-supporting. And he had marvelous, marvelous success. He wrote a couple of books, including one that crossed the desk of Dr. Wilbur, who was searching for a profession. And he referred to the treatment of idiocy by the physiological method. Dr. Wilbur read the book and decided that he wanted to bring this type of work to the United States, which he started with a very few children in Barre, Massachusetts. And within 2 years, he developed his Syracuse connection. Dr. Wilbur was the founding director for the Syracuse Developmental Center, what was originally the New York State Institution for Idiots and Imbeciles, which became Syracuse Developmental Center. 2 years into the project, he decided that he wanted to spread things further, and he was hired by the state of New York to develop these methods and offer a state institution. Dr. Wilbur is actually buried in Oakwood Cemetery, along with students from the Syracuse State School. I don't know if they overlapped in time. The earliest records we got were from the early 1900s, and I see Bud smiling. I made him go on a field trip with me to, to find the burial site, just to make sure that it was really there. So there is that connection in Syracuse. He passed school on to a man named Dr. George Brown, and the Brown family ran Elm Hill for the next 96 years. Elm Hill went from 1848, it was the first school for students with intellectual disability in the US. It even preceded this first state school in Massachusetts, which eventually became the Fernald State School, only by a few months, but Elm Hill was definitely first. And the Brown family kept the school within their family, and it was privately run until 1946 was when the last students left. So this was all really very fascinating. Barre, Massachusetts, I knew where that was, and I knew that probably the Historical Society had something. But then I had patered in the form of an archive, a 60-box archive with the records from the Elm Hill School, from its earliest days, from the 1840s, student record that started in 1850. And it was extraordinarily complete, and it was wonderful. And I discovered that that was there. I said, that's where I'm going. I'm going to go down to Philadelphia, and I'm going to spend a week in an archive. Now, here's where, like I say, this is going to tell a few tales out of school. I took rather a lot of ribbing for wanting to spend a vacation in an archive doing research. Even people who knew me very well were, yeah, really, that's what you're going to do. You don't think about golf. You don't think about the beach. You're going to go to an archive, and you're going to be in an archive and search things. I said, it's really cool. It's really fascinating stuff. And people were like, oh, yeah, for sure. I was really confused. I said, how is this different from what you know about me? I actually called my older sister and said, okay, so I'm doing this on vacation. Does that seem unusual to you? She said, oh, no. She said, that's been your MO since you could read. I said, okay, so it's not weird then. She said, I didn't say it wasn't weird. I said it was consistent with what we would expect. I said, okay, thank you, I think. So in the course of doing this research, I found myself for the first time since middle school worried about the whole concept of cool, and knowing for sure that I was not meeting it. So I started to think about that, and started to think about it in terms of expertise, and how expertise is actually a very cool thing to have. I look particularly at this political climate that we're in, and say people who know a lot about certain subjects this is important. And we have, because I look around the room and I see academics, I see people who have been apologizing for their intelligence for years, and that maybe we should stop doing that and just own that this is really interesting and this is really exciting stuff. As a matter of fact, I even found a book to back it up. Of course I found a book to back it up. This is a children's book, and the title of the book is Why Johnny Doesn't Flap. Neurotypical is okay. It is a children's book told from the perspective of a child with autism who doesn't understand why his neurotypical friend Johnny isn't an expert on anything. So yes, he says here, Johnny may never be an expert at anything, but he's a good person and that's okay. So I said, all right, well, I'm gonna be like this little kid, and I'm gonna be unapologetic for, really enjoying what it is that I'm enjoying. Oh, I just figured out what it was I was doing wrong. Just a second. So, when I say intellectual disability, first of all, anytime I talk about intellectual disability, I see a lot of people wince, and I think that that's a shame. Because that's something that we, as a society, have created. It's much more of an issue that we have than anything that would actually be a problem. And here are some things that I became aware of as I was writing that I think other people need to be aware of too. First of all, people with intellectual and developmental disability have been part of the human species since the beginning of time. Paleontologists are now beginning to discover the remains of ancient people whose skeletal remains and sometimes the shape of skulls or injuries that somebody may have experienced, that these were people who had cognitive disabilities, who lived for a long time, who were not abandoned, who were not, put aside in any kind of way, who were an integral part of the community. So if that's true way back, why wouldn't it be true now? And among the first people, or Native Americans, I discovered that really it was much more of a theme of what is this person contributing to the larger society versus what's wrong with this person. It was much more of a theme of inclusion among the first people. And that among the first European Americans who came to the colonies, that the earliest identified individual was born in the Jamestown colony. So he was there in the 1640s or 50s or something like that. So people with intellectual and developmental disability are simply part of American history, but we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about it. And overwhelmingly, this shocked me because of all of the history of surrounding institutions. And institutions were a horrible thing. But that was only really a very small part. 90% of people with cognitive disabilities have lived and continue to live in their communities, but always did. Now there was 10% of people who wound up locked in hell through no fault of their own. So yes, we need to be aware of that. Yes, we need to pay attention to that part of history. But what about all of the people who are out in the community? What are their stories? And it bothered me a little bit that it wasn't there. So that's where we started the story. Because this is what you think about usually when you think of an institution. This is a picture from Christmas in Purgatory, a book by Burton Blatt and Steve Kaplan. You think of one of these huge buildings and really looking much more like a prison than a school. Even though at the very beginning, this physiological method of segments was the one that was used in the state institutions. As eugenics came along and as people kept believing in cure as opposed to education, things got worse and worse. That's another whole book. But this is usually what you think of. This isn't what you think of when you think of an institution. Elm Hill was actually a very elite boarding school for children who had intellectual and developmental disability. When I went through some of the records, I saw addresses from Fifth Avenue, I saw addresses from Beacon Hill in Boston, very rich neighborhoods. Their parents had money, and these children were of value to their family, and they wanted their children to be educated. So we have a whole lot of assumptions that we need to be working through. When I see buildings like this and when I read histories about institutions, I'm reminded of what's called the drunk in the streetlight metaphor. We do a lot of research in schools and in institutions and in hospitals because everything was very, very documented there. So if you think about the drunk in the streetlight, there's a man sees another man down on his knees searching for his keys. And the man is obviously intoxicated, looking for his keys. He's very upset. And the other man says, well, I'll help you look for them. Where did you lose them? And when did you lose them? He said, well, I lost them actually 2 blocks ago. And the second man says, why are you looking here? And the drunk says, the light's better here. And it's, so why are we studying just what's there, just what's in the light? Sometimes you have to do a little bit more digging. And you do that digging in archives and in museums and in historical societies. Elm Hill eventually became a multi-building campus. The children who came there came sometimes with their own coaches, came sometimes with their own servants, came with horses. These were children who were very wealthy, from very wealthy families, and the families really wanted their children to become educated and to become part of hopefully a larger society. This is the other part that I really found amazing. As part of the archive, there were many photograph albums. Elm Hill, because it was so cutting edge in terms of the services and the education it was providing, went to the Chicago World's Fair. And the people, Dr. Brown and his wife, Catherine Brown, another fascinating individual you can read about in the book, put together this whole display so that people around the country could learn about Elm Hill. And they preserved a lot of the photographs, so the photographs of the buildings and a lot of the photographs of the children. Now, when you think back in history and think about people with developmental disability, this is what you might see in a medical textbook. This young man doesn't have a name. He is labeled as Case A. He is showing the signs of Down syndrome, and he's clearly posed to show the physical features of the syndrome. He has his tongue out, and he's sitting cross-legged to show that his limbs might be a little bit on the loose side. But that's not all that was going on. Here's a young man from Elm Hill. Now, he's not named. Many of the pictures were labeled, but this young man was not. But this is also a young man who looks as though he has Down syndrome, in a suit, in a tie, and he had his photograph taken by a private photographer, and it was kept in one of the photo albums at Elm Hill. And there were dozens of photographs of the children. There's a whole section in the back of the book with photographs of the children. And that was like opening Tut's tomb, because I had never seen people who I thought, I was told in my mind, were pushed aside. It didn't matter And yet clearly, I look at the pictures here and I said, well, somebody was obviously caring about these students. And the Brown family really cared about their students. There's a part in the book where Dr. Brown and his wife, Catherine Brown was an amazing woman. She was, from the earliest days, not just the helper to her husband. She was writing papers. She was a member of the Association of Directors of Schools for Children with Disabilities, and gave papers, public papers. And this is well before, of course, women could vote. And she was clearly kept everything in line. We also, a friend of mine at the Barry Historical Society found a journal that Catherine had kept about a trip that she and her husband had taken to bring one of the students home during the Civil War. As I say, Catherine was an incredible woman. The only thing she didn't do terribly well was penmanship. And unfortunately, she transcribed all of her husband's medical records, and it's atrocious. It was so bad. It took me really months to get through the copies and to see what the doctor had written about the children. Oh. My husband told me that I should tell this story. Again, speaking to academics, I don't think that I'm telling any stories out of school when I say that people who say, oh, you wrote a book. I've always wanted to write a book. I just want to go off to a cabin on the coast of Maine and just write and write and write and write. It is nowhere near that sexy a process. First of all, it takes a long time to, sort through all of the information. Most of my writing is done sitting on my couch or cross-legged on the floor, usually with a cat across my legs. I think she's getting a writing credit in the next book that I write because she's right there. The one time I tried to make this creation sexy or like Thoreau, in Walden Pond, we were on vacation in the Adirondacks to Blue Mountain Lake, which is where we go every year. And I said, I'm not bringing the computer. I'll bring my research folder and I will bring my notebook. Chapter 4 of this book was written mostly on the side of Blue Mountain Lake. Unfortunately, it nearly remained there. I was writing, I was really very happy with the work I'd gotten done, and I stood up, put my book and my writing folder safely up on the shore. At least I thought I did. I turned around in time to see 3 years of carefully curated research notes cascade into Blue Mountain Lake. And fortunately, the chapter still remains because, to answer the next question, yes, I jumped in after it. There really was no other way around it. I said, I'm not going back to Philadelphia to get this information. So I jumped into the lake. I'll leave to your imagination how I managed to get out. But yes, I did rescue all of the papers, and my car became a drying rack. So Dale and my son Sam were off golfing at the time. So fortunately it was alone, and nobody was nearby enough because I said a few things and the Dean of Education is here and I'm not going to hear. So it is a little messy. So why disability history? Why have a museum? Why write about hidden history and abandoned history? This is a quote that is it the motto, the organizing philosophy? Right. The organizing philosophy of the Museum of Disability History. It was written by a historian named William Loren Katz, who did research into another type of hidden history of African Americans in the American West. And this quote is from him. If you believe that people have no history worth mentioning, it's easy to believe they have no humanity worth defending. People with intellectual and developmental disability have very little history. I think probably that has a lot to do with low levels of literacy. I think some of it had to do with social stigma. I think some of it had to do with family shame. But the stories are there. If you ask people my age and above, Did you grow up knowing anybody who had a developmental disability? They invariably tell you yes, and there are usually some very interesting stories. But we're not collecting them. We're not gathering them up. We don't know what people's daily lives were like. And it's really, to lose that would really be a shame, because it is part of history. It's part of American history. It's part of human history. And I think people really do need to take the time to do this, because it informs our understanding of what it means to be of value in a culture. And it talks a lot about our definitions of humanity. And I don't think we can, I don't think we can ignore that. So where is the history? I think it's out there. I have a Facebook page which is titled History Worth Mentioning. You can go to Facebook and you can like that. I post stories. I also have a Gmail account with the same name. If you have people that you remember and you say, wow, I really would like to share this person's story, please share it with me. If you have family members who have passed away, if you have living parents and they have stories about family members. As a matter of fact, the book is dedicated to two family members of mine. My grandmother had two sisters who had significant intellectual disabilities, both of whom remained at home. One daughter, her name was Mary, died in the influenza epidemic in 1819. And the other daughter, her name was Rosemary, she lived at home with my great-grandmother, who had an 8th grade education, little old Irish Catholic lady, not exactly a rebel, but she kept her daughter home because she felt that that was her responsibility to her child, and a remarkable number of families felt the same way. And eventually Rosemary went into a nursing home, so my mother and her siblings knew about her, but we nearly forgot about Mary. So a family member, and if you, any of you who are from Irish Catholic backgrounds, to lose a family story is a sin. And we nearly lost her, just because nobody wrote it down. So I wrote her name in the dedication, so nobody's going to forget that Mary Davlin lived, even if she lived for just a short amount of time. And that Rosemary Davlin lived and was very loved by her family. So if you hear of any other stories like that, please make sure that you share them. I would love to read what you have to say. Now, just going to put everything up here at once so I don't have to run back and forth. My tremendous thanks to the Museum of Disability History for taking a risk on somebody who was an unknown article, and your willingness to work with me. You have a wonderful museum, and I hope people go, and that we have more of a presence. Great thanks to the members of the Barrie Historical Society. My husband Dale came with us on this trip, and the ladies in the Historical Society were delighted to talk to me. They remembered from the time they were tiny children some of the residents of Elm Hill, and were able to tell me some stories. And there was one woman who took my husband around town to take pictures. Her name was Audrey. When we left, I got a nice handshake. Dale got a hug. Clearly the people in Barrie liked Dale a lot more than they liked me, but they were very kind. Thank you to Syracuse University School of Education, and particularly the people at the Taishoff Center for Inclusive Higher Education and the staff of Inclusive U, because you folks are a pleasure to work with, and it is an honor to be doing this work here. And finally, to my husband, Dale Katovitch, you had the pleasure to meet. I love to bring him and show him off, because without your support, this wouldn't happen. And thank you very much. So thank you, everybody, for coming.